Two water canisters, one full, one empty. A 14-year-old boy vanished without a trace from a familiar trail in less than 10 minutes. No footprints, no screams, no body, just silence. What happens when someone disappears from reality itself, only to return 12 years later with a story that would change wilderness safety forever? Stay with me, because the story of Julian Thorne will grip you from the very first moment to the last. Welcome to Codecase Crimelab, where we explore the darkest corners of the human psyche through fictional narratives that feel terrifyingly real. I'm your host, and today's story will take you deep into the wilderness, into isolation, survival, and the unbreakable human spirit. Before we begin, if you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And let me know in the comments, what scares you more, being lost in the wilderness or being found by the wrong person? Now, let's dive into the case of Julian Thorne. This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, locations, and incidents are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is presented for entertainment purposes only. Julian Thorne, age 14, a Boy Scout who never lost his compass, literally or metaphorically. The son of Thomas and Martha Thorne, raised to value precision and self-reliance. A quiet, responsible boy who always came prepared. July 17, 1989, the fictional Blackwood Wilderness, upstate New York. The summer air carried the scent of pine and possibility. 50 teenagers had gathered at Shadow Creek Scout Camp, a place built on tradition and outdoor survival skills. Among them was Julian Thorne, methodical, steady, dependable. His parents, Thomas and Martha Thorne, had raised him well. Thomas was an accountant, Martha a librarian. Julian was their pride, the kind of kid who triple-checked his gear and never deviated from the plan. On that humid evening, as the sun cast amber light through the towering pines, Julian's group prepared for their ultimate challenge, a night navigation exercise deep in the old-growth forest. Camp leader David Harrison, weathered and experienced after 20 years on these trails, coordinated the final preparations. Then came a minor problem. The water canisters hadn't been filled. Julian volunteered immediately. "I'll be back before you finish the gear check," he said with his characteristic confidence. He grabbed 2 one-gallon plastic canisters and headed down the well-worn path toward the stream 200 yards away. The soft thud of his boots faded into the forest. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. David Harrison checked his watch, a slight furrow creasing his brow. Julian was a boy of habit. He didn't dawdle, didn't deviate from the plan. When the silence stretched beyond reason, Harrison sent 2 older scouts to check on him. Bobby and Mark jogged down the trail. 5 minutes later, they returned at a frantic, stumbling run, their faces drained of color. "He's not there, Mr. Harrison," Bobby gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The jugs are there, but Julian, he's just gone." Harrison sprinted to the stream himself, his heavy flashlight cutting through the gathering dusk. What he found defied all explanation. On a flat granite stone at the water's edge sat the first canister, filled, capped, placed precisely as if by careful hands. Several feet away lay the second canister, empty, its cap missing. The mud showed clear impressions of Julian's hiking boots where he'd knelt to fill the containers. But there were no scuff marks, no signs of struggle, no drag marks, no footprints leading away into the brush. Harrison's voice shattered the evening stillness. "Julian!" He waited, every nerve straining to hear a response. Nothing. No cry for help, no sound of movement through the undergrowth, no breaking branches. Julian Thorne, a disciplined Boy Scout trained to signal if in danger, had vanished from a familiar path in less than 10 minutes without making a single sound. As darkness consumed the forest that July night, one fact became terrifyingly clear. Julian hadn't simply wandered off. He had been erased. By 2200 hours on July 17th, Shadow Creek had transformed from a peaceful camp into the center of a massive police operation. Essex County Sheriff Robert Mitchell, a 30-year veteran of Wilderness Patrol, established a command post in the camp's dining hall. Mitchell understood the forest's deceptive nature better than most. It could hide secrets beneath a single layer of pine needles or swallow entire trails in a sudden storm. He immediately ordered a search of the 5-mile radius around the camp. As the hours ticked toward midnight, the woods remained absolutely silent. By dawn on July 18th, the search had escalated dramatically. Over 200 volunteers, local woodsmen, college students, concerned citizens, organized into systematic line searches. They moved arm to arm through the undergrowth with agonizing slowness, probing every thicket and hollow log. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept overhead, their rotors vibrating through the valley. Yet every report came back the same: nothing. No heat signatures, no torn clothing, no sign of a boy trying to survive in the wilderness. Then came the first truly disturbing anomaly. 2 bloodhounds were brought to the stream where the canisters had been found. The dogs immediately picked up Julian's scent, lunging forward with urgent bang. They led handlers 300 meters into dense spruce toward a natural elevation in the terrain. Then they reached a wide, flat stretch of granite and stopped dead. Both dogs began circling frantically, their bays turning to high-pitched, anxious whines. They sniffed at the solid rock, then looked up into empty air, tails tucked between their legs. To the experienced handlers, the behavior was completely inexplicable. It was as if Julian Thorne had simply ceased to exist at that exact spot. The trail didn't fade gradually. It ended abruptly on barren rock. There were no cliffs to fall from, no caves to fall into, no trees low enough for a boy to climb. Thomas and Martha Thorne arrived at the camp later that day in catatonic shock. Martha refused the offered motel room, choosing instead to sleep in a tent near the command post so she could hear every radio transmission, every update, every whisper of hope. Thomas walked the perimeter 20 hours a day, his voice growing hoarse from calling his son's name, driven by the desperate belief that Julian was just beyond the next ridge, just past the next tree line. By the end of the first week, the search had expanded to 50 square miles. Divers probed the dark depths of nearby Shadow Pond, finding nothing but silt and sunken timber. The local media descended like vultures, their satellite trucks clogging narrow mountain roads. The story of the vanishing scout became a national sensation, fueled by the complete lack of clues and the eerie precision of those abandoned canisters. On the 21st day, 3 full weeks after Julian's disappearance, Sheriff Mitchell held a press conference that would be remembered as the official end of hope. His face gray, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, he announced that the active search phase was being terminated. While the case would remain open indefinitely, the hundreds of volunteers were sent home and the helicopters returned to their bases. Martha stood by the stream one last time, staring at the spot where the canisters had sat. The authorities had issued a presumed dead status for their internal files, a piece of paper Thomas and Martha refused to acknowledge, refused to sign, refused to accept as truth. They left the wilderness that day, returning to an empty house in Albany, but they left with devastating knowledge. The forest had not given up a single secret. If you're hooked on this story, make sure you hit that like button right now. Your engagement helps us bring you more compelling content like this. The transition from a missing person search to a cold case is a slow, agonizing erosion of hope. By autumn of 1989, the vibrant colors of fall had faded into skeletal grays, and the official presence at Shadow Creek had completely evaporated. The Essex County Sheriff's Department moved Julian Thorne's file to a heavy metal cabinet in the basement, where it sat among hundreds of other unresolved tragedies, gathering dust. For Thomas and Martha, time didn't move forward. It crystallized around the moment their son disappeared, trapping them in an endless loop of that July evening. In their suburban Albany home, a profound act of preservation took place. Martha refused that a single item in Julian's bedroom be touched. The half-finished model of a P-51 Mustang remained on his desk, its plastic wings forever awaiting glue. His schoolbooks stood neatly on shelves, spines uncracked. His bed was made with the same blue quilt every single morning, as if he might walk through the door at any moment. This room became a sanctuary of grief, a museum of a life paused mid-sentence. Thomas became a man of restless, desperate action. He spent weekends driving back to the wilderness, not to search anymore, but to sit at gas stations and diners, showing Julian's photo to anyone who would look. Waitresses memorized his face. Gas station attendants knew his story by heart. He became a familiar tragic figure to locals, the man looking for a boy the forest had already forgotten. During this decade of silence, there were whispers. Deep within police logs from 1990 and 1991, at least 3 separate reports came from hikers in the North Creek region, 12 miles from Shadow Creek. They described a man they called the Trapper, a solitary figure living in a cabin so deep in the brush it didn't appear on any survey maps. One report specifically mentioned seeing a young boy with this man, a boy who seemed unusually quiet and never looked up from his work, never made eye contact. But because these sightings occurred so far from the original disappearance point, and because the wilderness was home to many eccentric hermits and off-grid survivalists, local police dismissed the leads as irrelevant. The prevailing theory remained that Julian had perished somewhere near the camp, his body claimed by the forest. Reports of a child in the deep woods were treated as misidentifications or wishful thinking. Behind this official negligence, a darker reality was taking shape, one that wouldn't be discovered for 12 more years. As the mid-90s approached, media interest finally died completely. The vanishing scout was no longer a headline, no longer a water cooler conversation. Family gatherings became defined by what wasn't said. They spoke of weather, politics, other children's graduations, anything but the empty chair at every holiday table. But Julian's name became a weight no one knew how to lift. Thomas and Martha lived in a state of what psychologists call ambiguous loss, a psychological purgatory where the absence of a body meant the absence of closure, and the absence of closure meant hearts could never truly heal. 12 years passed, 4,283 days of checking mail for letters that never came, staring at a phone that never rang with news of Julian. The Albany Police Department cycled through 3 different chiefs of detectives. Julian's file grew yellow at the edges, the ink on witness statements beginning to fade like forgotten memories. By late September 2001, the world's attention was gripped by global tragedies. The story of a boy lost in 1989 seemed like ancient history, a relic of a different era. No one could have predicted that on a rainy morning in October, the museum Martha had built would suddenly become obsolete. The ghost was about to walk out of the mist. October 3, 2001. 12 years, 2 months, and 16 days after Julian Thorne vanished from Shadow Creek Scout Camp. A cold, persistent drizzle hung over Albany like a wet wool blanket, the kind of rain that seeps into your bones. Sergeant Marcus Reed was filing paperwork at the Albany police station when the heavy glass doors swung open. A figure stepped into the lobby that seemed to belong to another world entirely, to another time. The man was severely emaciated, his skeletal frame barely holding up oil-stained jeans cinched with frayed rope. His skin possessed a sickly, translucent pallor, the complexion of someone deprived of natural sunlight for years. A thick, matted beard hid most of his face, and greasy hair hung in unkempt clumps around his shoulders. Reed's initial instinct was to treat him as one of many displaced souls seeking shelter from the rain. But when the man approached the desk, he didn't ask for coffee or a place to sleep. He leaned forward, hands trembling violently against the counter, and spoke in a voice like sandpaper on wood. "My name is Julian Thorne. I was taken from a Boy Scout camp in the wilderness 12 years ago." Then he added a sentence that chilled Reed to the bone. "I need you to lock the doors, because he might come to take me back." The initial reaction was profound skepticism. The Julian Thorne case was legendary in New York law enforcement, a cold case so old it had reached almost mythic status. Over the years, dozens of people had claimed to be the missing scout, seeking attention or money or both. But as Reed looked into the man's eyes, he saw something fundamentally different: absolute primal terror. A gaze that was sober and intelligent, yet haunted by fear so deep it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Reed didn't dismiss him, he didn't laugh it off or send him away. He asked the man to sit in a secure interview room and immediately contacted Detective Karen Fisher, a veteran with a photographic memory for the department's cold files. When Fisher entered the room 20 minutes later, she was immediately struck by the man's presence. He didn't just look malnourished, he looked like someone who'd forgotten how to exist in a brightly lit modern space. He flinched at fluorescent lights and kept his back pressed firmly to the corner, staring at the closed door with the intensity of a trapped animal. Fisher began a preliminary interview, recording the session digitally. The man provided his date of birth, March 23, 1975, and his parents' names without any hesitation. But it was when she asked about the camp that skepticism began to dissolve like morning fog. He described the exact layout of the Shadow Creek dining hall down to the color of the paint, the specific color of the kayaks stored behind the equipment shed, even the nickname of the camp cook's dog, Buster, a detail never published in any newspaper or broadcast in any news report. An expedited DNA test was ordered immediately. In 1989, Thomas and Martha Thorne had provided biological samples to be kept on file, stored in the hope that one day they might be needed. Now, 12 years later, those samples would either verify a miracle or expose a cruel hoax. The 48 hours that followed were suffocating tension for everyone involved. When results finally appeared on the screen, the probability of match was 99.99%. The emaciated man sitting in the interview room was, beyond any shadow of doubt, the 14-year-old boy who'd vanished from a stream bank in 1989. Detective Fisher made the phone call Thomas and Martha had waited 4,410 days to receive. When Martha answered, the silence after the revelation was so long, Fisher feared the woman had suffered a heart attack. Thomas found his voice first, repeating a single word over and over: alive, alive, alive. The reunion wasn't the cinematic moment of joy the public might have imagined. When the Thornes were brought to the station the following morning, they were prepared for a miracle, but were met instead with tragedy. Martha entered the observation room and stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at the man sitting at the table, the hollowed-out eyes, the scarred hands, the trembling frame, and struggled desperately to find her steady, confident son within this wreckage. She approached slowly, as if approaching a wounded bird that might fly away at any sudden movement, and reached out to touch his cheek. Julian didn't pull away, but he didn't move toward her embrace either. He simply began to sob, a sound Martha later described as the most painful thing she'd ever heard in her entire life. It was the sound of 12 years of suppressed terror finally breaking the surface. Thomas stood in the doorway, shoulders shaking, unable to bridge the distance between past and present. They had their son back, but the Julian who loved baseball and model airplanes, who earned merit badges and told jokes at dinner, was gone, replaced by a man hollowed out by a decade of darkness. Immediate medical assessment revealed the devastating physical toll. Julian weighed only 120 pounds despite his nearly 6-foot frame. He suffered severe vitamin D deficiency, decaying teeth that would require extensive dental work, and permanently impaired vision from years spent in low-light environments. But physical wounds were nothing compared to the psychological barriers. Julian refused to let anyone close his hospital room door, yet was simultaneously terrified to look out windows. He spoke in a flat, monotone whisper that barely rose above silence. Every time a male staff member entered the room, he instinctively shielded his face with his hands. The ghost had returned from the wilderness, but as investigators prepared to take his formal statement, they realized with growing horror that the true nightmare was only beginning to be told. The formal debriefing began on October 5, 2001, in a secure, climate-controlled room at Albany Medical Center. Present were Detective Fisher, Dr. Martha Thorne, a specialist in captivity psychology, and the Essex County District Attorney. The session was videotaped, providing a haunting visual record of a man struggling to reconstruct a decade of shattered reality. Julian sat at the very edge of his chair, eyes constantly darting toward ceiling corners as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows, hands constantly tracing old scars on his wrists. He began with the evening of July 17, 1989. As he filled the second canister at the stream, a man approached from the brush. The man, whom he would later know as Silas Vance, was dressed in standard hiking gear and spoke with calm, paternal authority that immediately disarmed a 14-year-old boy's natural defenses. Silas claimed to be an instructor from a nearby camp and offered to show Julian a hidden cave just a few hundred yards away, promising it would be the highlight of his entire summer. It was a classic predator's lure, expertly exploiting a young scout's curiosity and deeply ingrained respect for adult authority. Julian followed for what felt like 10 minutes into increasingly dense thicket, away from all marked trails. When Julian finally grew suspicious and turned to leave, the friendly facade evaporated in an instant. Silas produced a high-voltage stun device. The last thing Julian remembered of his childhood was the sharp smell of ozone and the crushing weight of the forest floor as consciousness faded into absolute blackness. When Julian woke, he was in total darkness, his limbs bound with rope. He was in the basement of Silas Vance's hunting lodge, a structure hidden 12 miles from the nearest paved road, reachable only by a labyrinth of overgrown logging paths that hadn't been maintained in decades. The basement had been meticulously prepared long before Julian's abduction. Silas had lined the walls with thick carpets and layers of foam rubber, creating a completely soundproof cell that swallowed Julian's screams as if they'd never existed. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a planned environment designed specifically for long-term retention of a human captive. Silas didn't immediately harm Julian in traditional physical ways. Instead, he engaged in a devastating campaign of psychological manipulation that was, in many ways, far more effective than any chain. During the first weeks of captivity, he brought Julian fresh newspapers, carefully curated issues from 1989 detailing the failing search effort. He told Julian the world outside was collapsing. Silas constructed an elaborate delusion, claiming that global conflict had erupted shortly after Julian's abduction, that major cities like Albany had been decimated by war, that Julian's parents were almost certainly gone, probably killed. He convinced the terrified boy that the forest was the only safe place left on Earth, and that he, Silas, wasn't a kidnapper, but actually a savior who'd plucked him out of certain annihilation. To a terrified 14-year-old completely isolated from all outside information, cut off from everything familiar, the lie became a survival mechanism. Silas became the only source of food, information, and protection in a world Julian believed had ended. The physical reality of Julian's life for the next 4,400 days was one of grueling forced labor and relentless psychological control. Silas viewed Julian not as a person with rights and feelings, but as a useful tool to be exploited. During spring and summer months, Julian was taken outside under the constant threat of a loaded hunting rifle. He was forced to chop wood for hours on end, skin trapped animals, maintain the lodge's deteriorating structure. Silas was a hardcore survivalist who prided himself on living completely off-grid, using Julian as unpaid slave labor to sustain that lifestyle. The question of why Julian never attempted escape during these outdoor work sessions was answered in a single, chilling anecdote that Detective Fisher would never forget. During his first month of captivity, Julian managed to slip his restraints during the night and fled desperately into the woods. He ran blindly through the darkness for nearly a mile before being intercepted by Silas. Silas didn't drag him back to the lodge immediately. Instead, he forced Julian to kneel in the dirt and fired a rifle round mere inches from the boy's ear. The muzzle flash temporarily blinding him, the thunderous report permanently damaging his hearing in that ear. Silas leaned down close and whispered that the next round wouldn't miss, and that the monsters in the woods were far more merciful than he would be if Julian ever tried to run again. This single act of calculated terror, combined with the false belief that his family was dead and the world destroyed, effectively broke Julian's will completely. He entered a state psychologists call learned helplessness, a condition where victims perceive absolutely no possibility of escape and cease trying, even when real opportunities arise. As years blurred into an endless gray cycle of seasons, Julian's very identity began to erode like sand in water. He lost track of his exact age, forgot his middle name, struggled to remember the precise face of his mother. Silas provided discarded clothing and fed him canned goods and wild game, but denied any intellectual stimulation, any books, any connection to the outside world. The basement became Julian's entire universe during the harsh upstate New York winters, locked away in darkness for months at a time as snow buried the lodge up to the eaves. In that soundproof void, Julian lived in complete sensory deprivation, his only companion the rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker on the outside walls, a sound he began to associate with the passage of time itself. By the time Julian reached his early 20s, the power dynamic had shifted through simple attrition. Silas was aging, his movements growing increasingly sluggish, yet the psychological shackles remained as strong as iron chains. Julian had become the unwilling housekeeper of his own nightmare, maintaining the very prison that held him captive. He could navigate 12 miles of dense forest with his eyes closed, yet was so thoroughly convinced of the world's destruction that he never once looked toward the horizon, never once tried to find civilization. The 4,400 days weren't just physical confinement, they were the systematic erasure of a human soul, piece by piece, day by day. As Julian finished this segment of testimony, his voice barely a whisper, the room in Albany was absolutely silent except for the hum of recording equipment. Silas Vance hadn't just stolen a boy from a stream bank, He'd created a living ghost while Julian was still breathing. Drop a comment below and tell me what you're feeling right now. This story gets even more intense, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. While Julian began his painful path toward psychological reconstruction in Albany, a tactical response team from the Essex County Sheriff's Office prepared to infiltrate the deep woods. Guided by Julian's fragmented, trauma-clouded coordinates and descriptions, the search for Silas Vance's lair took 48 grueling hours of navigation through some of the most difficult terrain in upstate New York. On the morning of October 6, 2001, the team finally breached a hidden valley that seemed erased from time itself. Nestled against a limestone ridge 12 miles from the nearest logging road stood the hunting lodge, a sprawling single-story structure of blackened timber and rusted corrugated metal. The cabin was a testament to Silas Vance's pathological need for isolation and absolute control. The perimeter was cluttered with rusted animal traps and massive piles of ancient firewood, but the structure itself was a fortress of silence. As the tactical team moved in with weapons drawn, they found the front door standing partially ajar, the very door Julian had fled through just days earlier. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale alcohol, and the metallic tang of unwashed human skin. They found Silas Vance on the floor of the main living area. He'd suffered a massive stroke at some point after Julian's escape. He was still alive, but his body was essentially a useless shell, cloudy eyes staring blankly at the ceiling as he wheezed through a partially paralyzed throat. The forensic sweep that followed revealed the mechanical precision of Julian's 12-year ordeal. The basement was exactly as he'd described, a soundproofed tomb. Investigators found homemade metal sliding bolts on the outside of the door, heavy-duty locks that would be completely impossible to bypass from inside. The cabin where Julian had spent countless winters was a complete sensory vacuum, carpet-lined walls still bearing faint indentations where he'd leaned his head against them in absolute darkness. In a small wooden box, carefully hidden under Silas's bed, investigators found the trophies. Julian's 1989 Boy Scout uniform, neatly folded and preserved like a religious relic. Next to it was a thick scrapbook containing every single newspaper clipping about the search, grim testament that Silas had watched the parents' agony play out in real time, while their son sat in chains beneath his feet. But as the forensics team moved into the secondary storage shed behind the lodge, the case took an even darker, more disturbing turn. Under a false floorboard, they discovered items that didn't belong to Julian. Several different sizes of hiking boots, a rusted pocket knife with the initials RK carefully engraved, a small weathered backpack containing a faded hair ribbon. A detailed search of the surrounding grounds led to the discovery of 3 shallow, unmarked graves beneath a grove of weeping birches. The remains were skeletal, but preliminary forensic analysis suggested they were teenagers or young adults who'd vanished in the region, dating all the way back to the late 1970s. This shattered the entire narrative of Julian being a singular, isolated victim. Silas Vance wasn't just a kidnapper, he was a serial predator who'd used the vastness of the wilderness as a private graveyard for decades, hunting with impunity. Police investigators realized with sickening clarity that Julian was the only one who'd survived, not because of Silas's mercy or compassion, but because Silas had aged into desperately needing a laborer, a companion slave, to maintain his remote fortress as his own strength gradually failed. Julian had been chosen to live only because he was the last victim Silas had the energy to break and control. Silas Vance was transported under heavy armed guard to a secure medical wing at Albany Medical Center. The district attorney prepared an extensive list of charges: kidnapping, forced labor, multiple counts of murder spanning 3 decades. The nation waited for a confession, for some explanation of the why behind 30 years of systematic carnage hidden in plain sight. But the justice system was denied that closure. 4 days after the raid, Silas Vance suffered a second terminal stroke. He died at 3:11 a.m. without ever regaining consciousness, taking the identities of other victims and the true depths of his depravity to the grave with him. The death brought an abrupt, deeply unsatisfying end to any legal proceedings. There would be no trial, no public confrontation, no definitive answers for the families of other missing children whose belongings were moldering in that shed. The Essex County Sheriff's Office officially closed the case as solved by death of perpetrator. But for the investigators who'd walked through that lodge, who'd seen that basement cell, the file remained an open, bleeding wound. They'd rescued one man but uncovered a slaughterhouse that had operated in complete secrecy for an entire generation. As the lodge was ordered demolished by the county to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist shrine, focus returned entirely to Julian, now the only living witness to a monster's life, a man tasked with carrying memories of a decade of silence into a world louder and more complicated than anything Silas Vance had ever described in his twisted delusions. The demolition of Silas Vance's hunting lodge in late 2001 was a symbolic act of erasure, an attempt to wipe away physical evidence of evil. But for Julian Thorne, the debris of those 12 years couldn't be cleared away with a bulldozer and a match. The return to society wasn't a single triumphant moment, it was a grueling, inch-by-inch reclamation of human identity that had been methodically dismantled over more than 4,000 days. In the months following his escape, Julian lived in a state of complete sensory overload. The simple act of choosing a meal from a restaurant menu or hearing the electronic chime of a cell phone would send him into frozen panic attacks. To a man who'd been told for a decade that the world was a radioactive wasteland, the vibrant, chaotic reality of 21st century America felt like an elaborate, terrifying hallucination he couldn't escape. Julian's path to any semblance of a new normal was paved with the unwavering support of Thomas and Martha. They realized early in the process that they couldn't simply pick up where they'd left off in 1989. The 14-year-old boy they'd known was dead, his childhood stolen forever. In his place was a 26-year-old man who possessed the survival skills of a frontier pioneer, but the social development of a traumatized child. Martha, in an act of profound maternal sacrifice, finally dismantled the museum she'd kept for 12 years. She packed away the model planes and school books, the baseball glove and merit badges, realizing that Julian needed space that reflected his current reality, not constant reminders of the stolen childhood he could never reclaim. They moved to a quiet, secluded property in a different state, a house specifically designed with wide-open floor plans and large windows meant to combat Julian's debilitating claustrophobia. Under the careful guidance of Dr. Eris Thorne, Julian began a decade-long process of relearning how to be a person, how to exist in the world. He had to be taught that he was allowed to say no, that he could move from room to room without asking permission, that shadows in trees were just shadows and not threats. Psychological scars remained painfully sensitive for years. Julian couldn't sleep in a bed. He preferred the hard floor near an open door where he could see any potential threat approaching. He maintained a visceral, uncontrollable fear of loud, sudden noises his traumatized brain still associated with the crack of Silas's rifle near his ear. But slowly, painfully, the prisoner syndrome began losing its iron grip. Julian found unexpected solace in technical tasks, tasks requiring the same precision and focus as his childhood model-building days, but without the need for frequent stranger interaction. He eventually found employment in remote data analysis, a job that allowed him to work from the safety of home, maintaining a bridge to the modern world without being completely overwhelmed by it. The legacy of the Silas Vance case left a permanent mark on the American psyche and law enforcement community. It became a foundational case study in long-term victim retention, analyzed by police departments and psychological researchers worldwide to better understand the complex mechanics of psychological entrapment. The discovery of other victims' remains led to the identification of 2 missing teenagers from the late 1970s, providing cold, bitter closure to families who'd spent 30 years trapped in the same purgatory as the Thornes. Julian, though avoiding the media spotlight with the ferocity born of deep trauma, eventually used the $200,000 settlement from Vance's meager estate to establish a private foundation. The fund was dedicated to providing advanced thermal imaging equipment to search and rescue teams across the northeastern United States, a silent tribute to the boy he used to be and the help that never came when he needed it most. 20 years have passed since that rainy morning in Albany when a ghost walked back into the world of the living. Julian Thorne is now a man in his late 40s. He's managed to build a life that is quiet, stable, and remarkably private. He's married to a compassionate woman who understands that some parts of his soul will always remain trapped in that soundproof basement, and she loves him anyway. They have a child together, a son, whom Julian watches over with vigilance that is both tender and fierce. He never takes him camping in the deep woods. For Julian, the forest is no longer a place of adventure and merit badges. It's a stark reminder that monsters don't need claws or fangs or supernatural powers. They only need a convincing lie and a locked door. Thomas and Martha lived long enough to see their son find a version of peace, however fragile. Thomas passed away in 2018, Martha in 2022. In her final days, Martha told a close family friend that the greatest miracle wasn't that Julian came home alive, but that he somehow learned to love the world again after it had been so unspeakably cruel to him. The Thorne family story ended not with a grand legal victory or a Hollywood ending, but with a quiet, profoundly human one. Julian still flinches instinctively at the sound of a woodpecker tapping on wood. He still carries his father's old silver lighter everywhere, flicking it open and shut when he needs to ground himself firmly in the present moment. He is a man reclaimed from the absolute void, living proof that even the deepest, darkest shadows can be pierced by the persistent light of truth. Julian Thorne was the boy who came back from the dead, and every single morning that he wakes in a room with an open door, with sunlight streaming through windows, he wins a final, silent victory over the man who tried so hard to convince him the sun would never rise again. This has been a fictional exploration of survival, captivity, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. While Julian Thorne's story is entirely imagined, it reflects the very real psychological dynamics of long-term captivity and the extraordinary courage required to reclaim one's life after unimaginable trauma. Let me give you the key facts of this case. The victim, Julian Thorne, a 14-year-old Boy Scout from Albany, New York. When it happened? July 17, 1989, at Shadow Creek Scout Camp in the fictional Blackwood Wilderness, upstate New York. When it was solved? October 3, 2001, 12 years, 2 months, and 16 days after Julian's disappearance, when Julian walked into that police station and the truth finally emerged. Where it happened? The fictional Blackwood Wilderness in upstate New York, specifically at Shadow Creek Scout Camp and later at a hidden hunting lodge 12 miles deep into the forest, accessible only by abandoned logging roads. The resolution? Julian escaped when his captor, Silas Vance, suffered a stroke. Vance was discovered by authorities but died 4 days later without ever standing trial, taking the full extent of his crimes to the grave. 3 additional victims were discovered buried on the property, their identities revealing a pattern of predation spanning 3 decades. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the fragility of safety and the strength of the human spirit, I need you to do 3 things for me right now. First, hit that like button. It tells me you want more deep-dive fictional crime narratives like this one, stories that explore the darkest corners of human behavior and the light that can emerge from absolute darkness. Second, subscribe to Codecase Crimelab and turn on that notification bell. We release compelling fictional crime stories every single week, each one crafted to keep you engaged from the first word to the last. Don't miss out on stories that will challenge how you see the world. Third, drop a comment below. Tell me, what part of Julian's journey affected you most? Was it the 12 years of silence? The moment he walked into that police station? The strength it took to rebuild his life? Or maybe the heartbreak of Thomas and Martha waiting for 12 years? I read every single comment, and your thoughts help shape future stories. And here's something to think about. What would you do if someone you loved vanished without a trace? How long would you hold on to hope? Let's discuss it in the comments. Before you go, I want to hear from you. This story explores themes of isolation, psychological manipulation, and the unbreakable will to survive. But it also raises questions about wilderness safety, the limits of search and rescue operations, and how predators exploit the vastness of nature. Here are some questions for you to consider. How do you think modern technology, GPS tracking, cell phones, advanced thermal imaging, would have changed Julian's story if it happened today? What do you think kept Julian going during those 12 years when he believed his entire world had been destroyed? And perhaps most importantly, how do we protect the vulnerable when monsters hide in plain sight, using isolation as their weapon? Share your thoughts below. This community thrives on thoughtful discussion, and I want to know what's on your mind. Related content. If you found Julian Thorne's story compelling, you'll want to check out these other Codecase Crimelab episodes. The Silent Witness, a fictional account of a woman who escaped captivity after 8 years and became the key to solving multiple cold cases. The Forgotten Trail, the story of a hiking group that discovered something in the wilderness they were never meant to find. The Last Transmission, a deep dive into a fictional case where a park ranger's final radio call revealed a decades-old secret. You'll find links to all of these in the description below, or you can browse our complete collection right here on the channel. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I know this story was heavy. I know it touched on difficult themes: abduction, psychological torture, and the devastation of families torn apart by violence. These aren't easy topics to explore, even in fiction. But I believe there's value in understanding the depths of human cruelty alongside the heights of human resilience. Julian's story, though fictional, honors the real survivors who faced similar ordeals and found the strength to reclaim their lives. Stories like this remind us to stay vigilant, to trust our instincts, to never assume that evil announces itself with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile and offers to show you something interesting just off the trail. Safety message. While this was a work of fiction, the lessons are real. If you're heading into the wilderness, whether for camping, hiking, or any outdoor activity, please remember, always tell someone exactly where you're going and when you expect to return. Never separate from your group, especially in unfamiliar territory. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Carry a whistle, a charged phone with offline maps, and basic emergency supplies. And teach children that it's okay to say no to adults who make them uncomfortable, even adults in positions of authority. Julian's story is fiction, but the dangers of isolation and psychological manipulation are very real. Final thoughts. The tale of Julian Thorne is ultimately a story about hope persisting in impossible circumstances. It's about parents who never stopped believing. It's about a boy who became a man in the worst possible way, but still found the strength to step back into the light. It reminds us that closure isn't always neat, justice isn't always served in a courtroom, but survival, true survival, isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding reasons to keep living when every reason has been stripped away. Julian woke up every morning in that basement for 12 years, and he chose to survive. That's not just resilience, that's the human spirit refusing to be extinguished. This has been a Codecase Crimelab. I'm your host, and I'll be back next week with another gripping fictional narrative that explores the darkest corners of the human experience. Until then, keep the light on, stay vigilant, and remember, the wilderness is beautiful, but it's also vast enough to hide secrets for decades. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and share this episode with someone who appreciates deep, thought-provoking crime narratives. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community. And, most importantly, thank you for bearing witness to Julian's story, even though it was painful. I'll see you in the next episode. Stay safe out there. This was a complete work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, locations, and incidents were products of creative imagination. No real persons or actual events were depicted. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events is purely coincidental. If you or someone you know has been affected by abduction, captivity, or similar trauma, please reach out to professional resources. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, RAIN, and other organizations provide support and assistance.